Hey everyone, I'm Mr. Stick Scares. Tonight, we're heading straight into the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where shadows stretch long and whispers hide in the trees. I've gathered 8 true Appalachian horror stories, encounters that prove these mountains hold more than just beauty. They hold secrets you were never meant to hear. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? It's always eerie to see just how far these stories reach across the world. Now, let's take our first steps into the haunted ridges of Appalachia. Story number 1. I wasn't planning to stop in Inverarray at all. My road trip through the highlands was meant to be quick, just a drive with a few nights in scattered inns before catching the ferry out. But the tank was low, my stomach was hollow, and the town looked alive enough when I rolled in, so I pulled over. I told myself I'd just grab a pint and a meal, nothing more. The pub sat on the main street, its windows glowing warm against the dark. Inside, the place smelled of beer and old wood, and every head turned when I walked through the door. That was normal enough for a stranger in a small town, but the way the looks lingered told me it wasn't just because I was new. In 1992, being a transgender woman on the road wasn't something you announced, but it wasn't something you could always hide either. A couple of men at the bar smirked before I even reached the counter. I ordered fish and chips and a pint. The barmaid, Isla, her name was stitched on her apron, gave me a quick smile, the kind that told me she'd already guessed I wasn't going to get a quiet night here. I took my glass to a corner table and tried to focus on the food, but the men started in with their muttered comments. "Not right, is it?" one said loud enough to carry. "Bloody circus come to town." Laughter followed. I kept my eyes down. It escalated when one of them, Rab, I'd learn later, came over and leaned against my table. He was red-faced, drunk enough to stumble, but steady enough to be mean. "So what are you then?" he asked. I didn't answer. "Think you're a lass, aye?" Nobody fooled here. His pals roared. I told him calmly to leave me alone. That only stoked it. He slapped the pint from my hand, the glass shattering on the floor. Isla rushed over, told him to sit down before she barred him. He sneered but staggered back to the bar. My hands were trembling, but I stayed. Leaving would have felt like giving them a victory. By the time I finished, I just wanted out. I paid quickly, thanked Isla under my breath, and walked outside. The night air was damp, the street mostly empty. My car was parked up the road, and I set off quickly, head down. I hadn't gone more than a dozen steps when shouting broke out behind me. Heavy boots on the cobblestones, then a scuffle. I turned just in time to see Rab and another man, Malky, someone had called him, shoving each other outside the pub. Rab swung first, a hard punch that sent Malky staggering. I froze, uncertain whether to intervene or keep moving. Before I could decide, Rab shoved him again, this time too hard. Malky's head struck the corner of the stone wall with a sound I can still hear if I think too long about it. He dropped instantly. I gasped, instinct pulling me toward him, but Rab was quicker. He looked around wildly, then at me, and his face twisted into something that chilled me more than the violence had. "You!" he shouted. "I saw you." "You did this. It was absurd, but..." Within seconds, the pub door flew open and people spilled out. All they saw was me near the body and Rab yelling. Hands grabbed me, rough and quick. Voices cursed me, called me freak, monster. Someone shouted to fetch the police. I tried to speak, to explain, but nobody wanted to hear me. In a matter of minutes, I was dragged to the small station, locked in a cell, and left to stew while the murmurs outside grew louder. My mind raced. I hadn't touched Malky, hadn't gone near him, but Rab's story carried weight because it fit the prejudice they already wanted to believe. Hours passed. An officer finally came, a broad man with eyes that avoided mine. He asked questions, but not in a way that suggested he was interested in answers. Where had I come from? Why was I in town? Did I know the victim? Did I admit to striking him? Every no I gave seemed to make him surer that I was lying. The horror wasn't in the cell or the threat of prison. It was in the realization that I could vanish into a system that didn't see me as worth believing. My word against his, and mine already worth less in their eyes. I barely slept, every creak of the station making me jump. The next morning, Isla came. She wasn't supposed to, but she told the constable she had information. She looked me in the eye through the bars and said quietly, "I saw it." It wasn't you, hope surged through me. She'd seen Rab push Malky. She'd watched him panic afterward. But her voice shook when she added, "They don't want to hear it." It took 2 more days before anything shifted. They kept me locked up, the murmurs in town growing, some calling for charges, others whispering it was a disgrace to have me there at all. Isla pressed on, though. She went to the back alley where the fight happened, found blood on the wall and on Rab's knuckle duster he'd dropped in the confusion. She brought it to the police. They couldn't ignore that. When they finally released me, it wasn't with an apology. It was with silence, the constable avoiding my eyes, shoving my belongings back through the slot. Outside, the town felt smaller, colder. I saw Rab being led in cuffs into the station, shouting about lies and setups. Nobody looked at me as I walked to my car. I didn't drive off immediately. I sat there gripping the wheel, breathing, trying to steady myself. I thought about Malky, dead because of a drunken shove, and how quickly the crowd had been willing to believe the worst of me. If Isla hadn't stepped forward, if that knuckle duster hadn't been found, I might never have left that cell. Before I pulled away, Isla appeared at the curb. She didn't smile, just said, "I'm sorry." For everything I thanked her, because words beyond that felt impossible. She nodded once, turned, and went back inside. I left in Verere and never returned. But the memory stayed sharp. The horror wasn't ghosts or shadows. It was people. What they choose to see, what they choose to believe. And how quickly a life can be broken when prejudice tips the scale. I've told this story only rarely because it still burns. I survived it, yes. Rab was convicted. I later learned from a letter Isla sent months after, her handwriting neat and firm. She said she hoped it gave me peace. But it didn't. Not really. Peace doesn't come easy when you've looked into the eyes of people who would rather see you guilty than human. That's the part that keeps me awake sometimes, even now. The knowledge that the scariest thing I faced on that road trip wasn't the isolation of the Highlands, but the people willing to destroy me without ever needing proof. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. Story number 2. When I was 12 years old, I thought the scariest thing about my paper route was the dogs. Bluefield was a small enough town that most folks knew the kids who delivered their papers, but there were always a few houses with chained-up hounds that barked and snapped at you just for riding past. I got used to it. What I didn't get used to was what happened one Saturday morning in 1980, something I kept to myself for years because I wasn't sure anybody would believe me. I had about 30 customers along a stretch of back roads outside of town, and I usually set out before the sun was up, so I could be home in time for breakfast. That morning, I'd loaded the canvas bag across my handlebars with folded newspapers and started my ride like always, coasting downhill and pedaling slow on the climbs. My parents trusted me to do it alone because it was supposed to be safe. Nothing ever happened out there, except maybe the occasional flat tire. About halfway through the route, I came to a long gravel drive that led to a white farmhouse. The family who lived there always tipped me a little extra, so I didn't mind the long ride up to the porch. I was halfway up the drive when I heard voices. At first I thought it was just the family talking, but the tone wasn't right. It sounded harsh, angry. I stopped pedaling and listened. That's when I heard the word money. Curiosity got the better of me. I left my bike leaned against a fence post and walked the rest of the way, holding the paper under my arm. The porch light wasn't on, but I could see shadows moving inside through the windows. I stepped closer and peered in. That was my mistake. 2 men, both wearing ski masks, were inside the living room. One of them had a revolver pointed at Mr. Dalton, the man of the house, who was on his knees with his wife and their teenage daughter beside him. Mrs. Dalton was crying quietly, and the girl's face was pale with shock. The other man was yanking open drawers and dumping things onto the floor, searching for valuables. I froze. I knew instantly I shouldn't be there, but my legs wouldn't move. My brain screamed at me to run, but my body just locked. Then the man with the gun said something that turned my blood cold. The kid said the money's in the cabinet. You better not be lying. I didn't know if he meant their kid or someone else, but it didn't matter. Mr. Dalton got up slowly, went to a tall cabinet by the wall, and opened it. He pulled out a cigar box, and I saw bills inside. He held it out with trembling hands. The masked man snatched it, counted quickly, and cursed. He shoved the barrel of the gun against Mr. Dalton's forehead. That's when my body finally reacted. I stumbled backward off the porch, trying not to make a sound, but my foot caught on the edge of the steps, and I tripped. The crunch of gravel under me was loud as thunder in my ears. Both men whipped their heads toward the window. One shouted, "Someone's outside!" I scrambled up and ran toward my bike, but I didn't make it far before I heard the front door slam open behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I grabbed my bike and kicked off as fast as I could, my newspaper bag bouncing against my side. I didn't dare look back, but I heard them shouting. I don't know if they chased me on foot or in a car, but every sound behind me felt like it was right on my neck. I pedaled until my legs gave out, then cut off the road into a patch of woods where I knew a narrow trail. I dragged my bike into the underbrush and lay down in the dirt, holding my breath. My whole body was shaking, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping too loud. After a minute, I heard an engine roar down the road. A car slowed near the trail, headlights sweeping past. I curled tighter into the leaves, praying they wouldn't see me. The car idled for a while, then sped off. I stayed hidden until the sky turned pale with morning light. Only when the birds started chirping and the silence settled in did I crawl out and push my bike back onto the road. I wanted to go home, but something pulled me back toward the Dalton house. I needed to know what happened. When I got there, the front door was wide open. The inside looked ransacked. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, but the family was gone. No sign of them. No blood. No bodies. Just empty silence. I left the newspaper on the porch, even though my hands were trembling so hard I almost dropped it. I rode home faster than I'd ever ridden before. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell the police. I was a scared 12-year-old who thought if I spoke up, the masked men would somehow find out it was me and come after my family. I convinced myself the Daltons would handle it, that maybe they called the sheriff themselves. But here's the part that haunts me. The next morning, their house was quiet again when I rode by. The newspaper from the day before was still sitting on the porch, untouched. The same thing happened the next day, and the day after. No cars in the drive, no lights inside at night. By the end of the week, I knew something was wrong. Word spread slowly in Bluefield, the way it does in small towns. People said the Daltons had left suddenly, moved away without telling anyone. But I knew that wasn't true. They hadn't moved. They'd been taken. I tried to carry on with my route, but every time I passed that house, I felt eyes on me. Once, I was sure I saw a car parked down the road with someone sitting inside, just watching. I pedaled faster, never daring to look back long enough to confirm it. At night, I'd lie awake imagining masked men breaking into my house, whispering about how they knew I'd seen too much. The sheriff eventually came around asking questions. He stopped at our house one evening while I was sitting on the porch. My father answered most of his questions, but when he asked if I'd noticed anything strange on my route that Saturday morning, my mouth went dry. I shook my head and muttered, no. I saw the doubt in his eyes, but he didn't press me. Maybe he figured a kid wouldn't notice much anyway. I kept that secret locked inside me for years. I grew up, moved away, tried to forget. But Bluefield is the kind of place you carry with you whether you want to or not. Whenever I go back, I drive past that old Dalton place. It's still standing, though it's changed hands a few times. Nobody stays long. They say it's just bad luck. But I know better. I sometimes wonder if those men ever got caught, or if they're still out there somewhere, older now but still carrying the memory of that morning like I do. I wonder if they remember the scrawny kid on the bike who saw too much. Sometimes I dream that one night they'll pull up outside my house, step out of a car with those same ski masks, and finally finish what they started. The thing that cuts deepest isn't just the fear, it's the guilt. If I'd spoken up, maybe the Daltons would have been found. Maybe justice could have been done. Instead, I stayed quiet, and a family vanished. That silence has followed me through every stage of my life, heavy as the newspapers I used to carry. Now, when I tell the story, I don't dress it up with talk of ghosts or shadows. It doesn't need that. What happened to me wasn't a nightmare or a trick of imagination. It was real men, real guns, real fear, and a real family who never came back. And the worst part is knowing I was the only witness, the one person who could have changed the ending, and I did nothing. That's the truth I live with. The paper route was supposed to be just a boy's chore, a way to make a little money and earn trust. But for me, it became the beginning of a secret that still keeps me awake at night. And if you're asking why I've finally told it now, it's because secrets don't stay buried forever. They wait, quiet as a house with newspapers piling on the porch, until the day someone opens the door and lets them out. Story number 3. I wasn't supposed to be driving that road at all. My assignment had been in Otavi, documenting rural burial practices, and I was only cutting through Tsumeb because I wanted to save time getting back to Windhoek. That shortcut was the only reason I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a bundle of clothing tossed at the side of the road. I nearly passed it by, but something about the shape pulled my eyes back. I slowed, and when I drew closer, I realized it was a boy. He was lying curled against the dirt edge, one arm bent unnaturally, his face streaked with blood and dust. I pulled over so fast my tires spat gravel. My heart hammered as I jumped out. Terrified, I was looking at a corpse. But his chest rose and fell, faint but steady. He couldn't have been more than 12. His eyes flicked open when I knelt beside him. They were wide and filled with a fear so raw it silenced me for a moment. I asked him what happened, if he could speak, but he shook his head violently, pressing his lips together as if terrified words would cost him something. His shirt was torn, his knees scraped raw, and one of his shoes was missing. I hesitated. Picking up a stranger, especially a child, was not something I was trained for, but there was no way I could leave him. I helped him into my truck, settling him on the seat beside me, and grabbed the water bottle from the console. He drank like someone who hadn't touched water in days. I asked if he had family nearby, if he'd been in an accident, but he wouldn't answer. He only clutched the water bottle with white knuckles and stared at the road ahead. I drove, thinking maybe I could take him straight to the police station in Sumeb. It wasn't far, but as we moved along, I noticed headlights appear behind us, a dusty white bakkie keeping a steady distance. At first I thought it was nothing, just another driver. But when I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up, they matched me. My gut twisted. The boy noticed too. His breathing quickened, and he shook his head violently, grabbing my sleeve with his good hand. He didn't say a word, but his message was clear. Don't stop. That was the first moment I felt real fear, not the academic kind of fear that comes with recording stories of death rituals, but the animal fear of knowing someone was hunting. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, my mind racing. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was coincidence. But the boy's grip tightened, and when I risked another glance in the mirror, I saw two figures in the backie's cab. The one in the passenger seat leaned forward, watching us with intensity. I told myself to think logically. If they wanted to pass, they would have. If they wanted to overtake, they had plenty of road to do it. No, they were tailing me. My throat went dry as I tried to plan. I didn't know the roads well. The boy began making low, whimpering sounds, almost like a puppy, as he stared out the window. I spotted a dirt track branching off to the left and made a snap decision, wrenching the wheel and flying down it. The truck bumped violently, and the boy slammed against the seat, but I kept my hands tight on the wheel. Dust rose around us, and for a moment, I thought maybe I'd shaken them. But the bakkie followed. Their engine roared closer, and I knew they weren't just curious strangers. I couldn't stop thinking about the boy's silence. Why wouldn't he speak? Who were they to him? The only thing that made sense, as the distance between us closed, was that they were the reason he was hurt. Traffickers. The thought hit me cold and undeniable. I'd read reports about children disappearing, though no one in anthropology wanted to connect the folklore to the living crimes. Now it wasn't folklore. It was in my truck, clutching my arm like I was his only chance. I pushed the truck as hard as it would go, my teeth rattling with the bumps, until I saw lights ahead. A small cluster of buildings, maybe a settlement. Relief surged through me like electricity. If I could get into a populated area, I'd be safe. But before I reached it, the bakkie swerved, pulling alongside me, trying to force me off the road. My truck lurched as our vehicles nearly touched. I saw the passenger clearly then, a man with a shaved head, grinning, pointing at the boy. My stomach turned. They wanted him, not me. That explained the fear, the silence. He wasn't mute. He was terrified to speak. I slammed the brakes hard, letting them surge ahead, then swerved behind them and shot forward. My truck fishtailed, but I managed to keep it straight long enough to barrel past and into the settlement. I pulled into the dirt square and laid on my horn until people came out. A few men in dusty shirts, women with headscarves, children peeking from doorways. The bakkie slowed at the edge, but didn't come in. They hovered like vultures before peeling away, dust trailing behind them. I was shaking so badly my hand slipped on the wheel. The boy clung to me, finally releasing a sob that broke whatever dam he'd built inside himself. I climbed out and shouted for help, explaining in broken bursts that he needed medical attention, that men were following us. One of the villagers, an older woman, came forward and put her arm around him. She spoke to him in Oshiwambo, her voice gentle. He responded with nods and shudders, still not speaking words, but clinging to her. They took us into a small building that served as a clinic. A nurse checked his injuries, confirmed his arm was badly sprained, maybe fractured. When I pressed again about the men in the bakkie, the boy finally whispered something to the nurse. She turned to me with a grim face. He said they had taken other children. He had escaped when their vehicle stopped for fuel. They hadn't even noticed he'd rolled out until too late. That night, the local police were called. They questioned me, the boy, the villagers. I gave every detail I could. The color of the bakkie, the shaved head of the passenger, the way they drove. The boy couldn't give names, but his terror told the whole story. The police nodded solemnly, said they knew of groups moving children across the border, said it was difficult to stop them. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the clinic while the boy dozed fitfully on a cot, waking every so often with a jolt, his eyes darting around. Each time he looked for me, and I nodded, reassuring him I wasn't going anywhere. By morning, the police offered to escort us into town. The boy was taken into protection, though I never knew what became of him after that. They said his family couldn't be traced. He might have been one of many children who'd already lost everything before those men found him. When I finally got back to Windhoek, I tried to return to my work. I buried myself in notes and reports, but I couldn't focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Dusty, bloodied, eyes so wide with fear they seemed older than a child should ever be. I thought of the men in the bakkie, how casual their grins had been. To them, he wasn't a person. He was cargo. That thought haunted me more than anything. That I had stumbled across something vast and cruel by accident, and that if I hadn't, he might have vanished into whatever abyss swallows children like him. I couldn't shake the feeling that the road had chosen me for that moment, that my shortcut wasn't coincidence. I never took that route again. In fact, every time I drove after that, I scanned every roadside, every ditch, terrified of what I might find and terrified of what I might miss. People sometimes ask me if what I do, anthropology, is dangerous. They think of rituals, of curses, of cultural taboos. I never tell them the truth, that the most dangerous thing I ever faced wasn't myth or folklore, but men with a truck and a business built on children's silence. Even now, decades later, I remember his grip on my arm, the silent plea in his eyes. He didn't have to speak for me to know the truth. Some roads are haunted not by ghosts, but by the living, and they're far more terrifying. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. Story number 4. I was driving back from a late hospital visit when I saw him standing on the side of the road near Boone. It was a quiet stretch, not the kind of place you'd expect someone to be waiting for a ride, especially at that hour. His thumb wasn't out, but he was facing the road, and when my headlights hit him, I saw he had no bag, no coat, nothing. I slowed down before I even thought about it. In those years, I often told myself that showing kindness was part of my calling, even when it didn't make sense. I pulled over, rolled down the passenger side window, and asked if he needed a ride. He got in without hesitation. His clothes were dirty, his hands rough, and there was a faint smell of sweat and iron about him. I told him my name and that I was a pastor at a local church. He didn't tell me his right away. He just said, "Appreciate it," and leaned back against the seat. For a mile or two, we sat in silence. I asked where he was headed. He said, "Out of town." "Anywhere, really." Something in his voice was dry, like he'd been carrying a weight all day. When I asked if he was all right, he let out a laugh, short and sharp, and said, "No, not really. I didn't push, not yet. I knew enough to let people open up when they were ready. My job had taught me that sometimes silence was the only way to keep someone talking." A few more minutes passed before he asked me if I believed people could be forgiven for anything. I told him yes, I believed that, though forgiveness didn't erase consequences. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Then he said, "What if it wasn't an accident?" The way he said it made my stomach clench. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, told him that all sin can be confessed, and that even the darkest deeds aren't beyond God's sight. But inside, I was replaying his words. Not an accident. He started telling me about a man he'd known since childhood. They'd grown up in the same county, worked some of the same jobs. He said this man had wronged him, stolen from him, humiliated him in front of others. I let it go for years, he said, his voice low, almost like he was talking to himself. But tonight, I couldn't let it go anymore. I asked what he meant. He looked at me then, eyes hollow, and said, I killed him. It's hard to describe what it felt like to hear those words in that confined space, the hum of the engine the only other sound. My first instinct was to think he was lying, maybe trying to scare me, but the flat way he said it, the absence of drama in his tone, convinced me otherwise. I asked him how it happened. He said they'd been drinking together, arguing, and he'd hit him with a wrench. He didn't stop after the first blow. He said the man's head wasn't right anymore by the time he walked away. I remember my mouth going dry. My mind split into two parts. The pastor in me trying to reach him, and the man in me calculating the danger I might be in. He was confessing to me, but he was also sitting right beside me in the dark. No one else around. I kept my voice calm and told him that carrying something like that alone would tear him apart. I said he needed to face it, to confess properly, to accept the law's judgment. He shook his head. The law won't forgive me. They'll bury me. That's why I got in your car. You're supposed to have answers for men like me. I wanted to pray with him, but something told me not to push religion too quickly. He was volatile, shifting in his seat, rubbing his hands over his knees. At one point, he pulled something from his pocket. My heart jumped, but it was just a small silver cross on a chain, broken. He said it had belonged to his mother. He gripped it so hard I thought it would cut into his palm. I asked him if he felt remorse. He said yes and no. That part of him wished he hadn't done it, but another part felt relief. He said he'd been waiting his whole life for the moment he finally stood up for himself, and now he wasn't sure if he'd damned himself beyond repair. We drove past miles of empty road, while I weighed my choices. If I told him to get out, I risked provoking him. If I drove him farther, I risked being complicit somehow. I thought about the victim lying wherever he'd left him, maybe still alive, maybe bleeding out. The urge to do something, anything, pressed on me, but so did the need to survive this ride. Eventually, I told him we should stop for gas. He didn't argue. I pulled into a small station on the edge of town. My plan was to get inside, find a phone, and call the police. But when I opened my door, he stayed put, eyes on me like he knew what I was thinking. I hesitated, then walked inside, trying to act normal. I told the cashier I needed the restroom and slipped into the back where I found a payphone. I dialed the sheriff's office, explained in hushed tones that I had a man in my truck who just confessed to murder. They told me to stall him. My legs were shaking as I walked back outside. He was gone. The passenger door was wide open, the seat empty. I looked around but didn't see him anywhere. The lot was quiet, no sign of him walking off or running. It was as if he'd vanished in the few minutes I'd been inside. The sheriff's deputies arrived within 10 minutes. I told them everything. They didn't doubt me, not with the detail I remembered. They asked for his description, his voice, his mannerisms. Later that night, I learned they had found a man beaten to death in a shed not far from where I'd picked him up. The description of the victim matched what the hitchhiker had told me. The weapon was a wrench. The timeline fit perfectly. They searched for the hitchhiker for days. Roadblocks, interviews, dogs, nothing. It was as though he disappeared into thin air after leaving my truck. Some thought he might have slipped into the mountains, hiding out. Others believed he had help, someone waiting to pick him up. I wrestled with what I'd experienced. On one hand, I knew I'd done the right thing, reporting him. On the other, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe he'd come to me because he wanted absolution, not justice. That maybe, as a pastor, I was supposed to have given him more than fear and a phone call to the police. Nights after, I dreamed of him sitting in my passenger seat, turning that broken cross in his hand, asking me if forgiveness was real. I woke up with the question in my ears, and no answer strong enough to quiet it. Months passed, and he was never caught. Some said he died out there in the woods, others that he fled the state and started a new life under a different name. But in the quiet of my own thoughts, I sometimes wonder if I was meant to be the last person he spoke to. If his confession to me was the only one he ever gave, and if he vanished, not because he escaped, but because he had nothing left in him to keep going. I've told this story only a handful of times. People expect me to have wrapped it up with a bow, to say that justice found him, or that he turned himself in. But the truth is, all that remains is his confession, and the weight it left on me. Every time I drive that stretch of road near Boone, I catch myself glancing to the passenger seat, half expecting to see him there again. Not because I believe in ghosts, but because the memory of that night never really left the cab. And if you ask me whether I believe he could have been forgiven, I'll tell you yes. But whether he believed it himself, whether he could have lived with the weight of what he'd done, that I'll never know. Story number 5. When I think back to 2012, the memory that always claws its way to the surface is not of the recitals I played, or the long hours practicing in my dorm, but of one night on a lonely road outside Cluj-Napoca when I lost something far greater than an instrument. I was 21 then, a music student obsessed with becoming the best violinist I could be. My violin was more than wood and strings. It had been my mother's, passed down when she died, and every note I played felt like I was carrying her voice forward. That violin was the reason I set out alone on a small road trip, planning to play in a few towns, busking and practicing away from the noise of school. I thought it would be a way to reconnect with the roots of the music I loved. I had no idea what it would actually lead me into. I was maybe an hour outside Cluj, on a narrow country road, when it happened. I had pulled off to the side because my phone buzzed with a message, and I wanted to check directions before going further. I left the violin case on the back seat, the way I always did, secured with the straps. I was still bent over my phone when a knock at the window startled me. A man in his 40s, dressed in a worn jacket, stood there smiling faintly and gesturing for me to roll the window down. Against my better judgment, I cracked it open. He said his car had broken down a little further down the road, asked if I had jumper cables. His Romanian was thick, local, but I understood enough. I told him no, sorry, and that was when another figure came up from behind my car. I felt the shift before I saw it, the sense of being surrounded. Before I could react, the man at my window reached quickly for the door handle. I locked it just in time, but the other one was already yanking at the back door. I panicked, fumbling to start the car, and in that few seconds they smashed the rear window. I screamed and pressed the accelerator, but not before one of them snatched the violin case from the back seat. I tried to slam the brakes, tried to stop, but fear overtook me, and I drove, the sound of glass crunching under my tires as I pulled away. For a moment I couldn't even breathe. My hands were slick on the wheel, my chest heaving, and all I could think was that my mother's violin was gone. I drove into the nearest village and stopped at a small gas station, shaking so hard I could barely explain what happened to the attendant. He let me use his phone to call the police. They arrived after an hour, listened to my story, nodded and promised to investigate, but their tone made it sound like they were humoring me. Just a stolen instrument, they said, though I insisted it was not just any violin. I should have gone home then. I should have accepted the loss and let the police handle it. But grief and anger are powerful things. That violin was everything to me, and I couldn't stand the thought of it sitting in the hands of men who didn't care what it meant. I decided I would at least try to find out where they had taken it. The next morning, I retraced the road. this time in daylight. I drove slowly, scanning for any sign of them. I found broken glass glinting near the roadside where it had happened. And not far from that spot, I noticed tire tracks pulling off into a wooded path. It wasn't much, but it was something. Against all logic, I parked and followed the path on foot. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trail led down to a clearing where several old storage buildings stood, rusted doors chained shut. I should have turned back, but then I heard it. Faint music, a violin being played, the notes haunting and wrong, like someone bowing with no skill. My stomach dropped. It was my violin. I knew its voice anywhere. I crept closer until I found a half-open door. Inside, 3 men sat around a table littered with bottles, and on the far side another man held my violin, scraping clumsy sounds from it while the others laughed. Rage surged through me. I wanted to burst in and grab it back, but I stayed hidden, watching. That's when I noticed what else was stacked in the room. Crates, dozens of them, some pried open, filled not with food or supplies, but with jewelry, electronics, even guns. My mind froze trying to process it. This wasn't just about my violin. It was a smuggling operation. I stepped back, heart racing, realizing what danger I had stumbled into. But before I could retreat, the door creaked. One of them turned, saw me in the shadows, and shouted. The others jumped up, the violin clattering to the floor. I ran. I don't remember every detail of that flight. Only the sound of boots pounding behind me, the burn of branches scraping my face as I pushed through the trees, and the thought that if they caught me, I would not walk away. I managed to reach my car, dove inside, and sped off before they could block me. My chest felt like it would split open from panic, but I had seen enough. I drove straight to the police station in Cluj, this time insisting they listen. At first, they looked at me with doubt, but when I told them exactly where the hideout was and what I saw, their expressions shifted. They told me to wait. Hours later, an officer returned to say they had raided the site. The smugglers were gone, but the crates were real. Weapons, stolen goods, even counterfeit passports. My violin was not there. I broke down in tears then, not just from the loss, but from the weight of what I had stumbled into. The officer tried to console me, said my information had helped uncover a larger ring they had been struggling to track. My violin, though, was likely long gone, sold, traded, or destroyed. For weeks I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the awful screech of those men trying to play it, twisting the sound of something sacred into mockery. I kept replaying that moment of deciding to follow the path, knowing how close I came to disappearing myself. My professors noticed the change in me. My playing became shaky, hollow. Without that violin, it was like part of my body was missing. Months later, I received a call from the police. They had caught 2 of the men. Among the items recovered in another raid was a violin case. My heart leapt. But when I rushed to the station and they opened it for me, it wasn't mine. Similar, but not mine. I think some part of me had already known it was lost forever. What I carry now isn't just grief. It's a kind of horror that lingers under the skin. Because in that warehouse, I saw more than smugglers and stolen goods. I saw men who laughed while twisting beauty into ugliness, who could take something precious and grind it under their boots without a thought. And I learned how quickly a simple road trip, a moment of carelessness, can pull you into a darkness you can't ever fully step out of. I did eventually get another violin, a gift from my father who tried to help me move forward. I play it still, but I never take it on the road, never leave it unattended. And every time I lift it to my shoulder, I think of my mother's violin lying in some forgotten corner of the world, silent or worse, being scraped to produce ugly sounds in hands that never cared about music at all. It's been years now, but when people ask me about the scariest moment of my life, I don't think of horror in the usual sense. I think of that night on a lonely Romanian road, the shatter of glass, the laugh of a stranger drawing nonsense from the strings that once carried my mother's songs. That is horror enough, and it has never left me. Story number 6. I didn't run from the church in a dramatic burst of lace and tears the way you see in films. It was quieter, stranger. One moment I was standing at the altar, listening to the priest's voice drone on, trying to focus on the words that should have been the happiest of my life. The next, I was staring at my fiancé, his eyes fixed on me in that cold, expectant way. And I felt the weight of something I couldn't name pressing against my chest. It wasn't nerves. I knew my body too well to confuse the two. It was dread, pure and sharp, and it told me if I said yes, I'd be walking into a trap I wouldn't escape. I don't even remember making the decision. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I dropped the bouquet, stepped down from the altar, and walked straight down the aisle past stunned faces. I didn't run, didn't speak, didn't explain. I pushed the heavy church doors open and walked into the street, the sound of my heels on the cobblestones ringing in my ears. My heart was hammering, but not from shame, from the certainty that if I didn't leave right then, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. My car was parked 2 blocks away, a small rental I had insisted on driving myself instead of letting his family chauffeur me. That decision saved me. I got in, pulled away, and only when the church was a shrinking figure in the rearview mirror did I allow myself to breathe. I had no plan. No clothes except the dress, no bag, no money apart from the envelope of cash I'd hidden from the wedding fund in case I needed it. But I had freedom, and in that moment, that was more valuable than anything. I drove without aim, through winding mountain roads, my hands tight on the wheel, my veil snagged on the seatbelt until I tore it off and threw it out the window. For hours, I didn't stop. My mind kept circling one thought. Why had I felt that dread? Why had the certainty of danger struck so suddenly, so violently, that I walked away from everything? It wasn't like me to be impulsive. I was careful, rational, raised to endure rather than escape. And yet, deep down, I knew I hadn't overreacted. It wasn't until the second night, parked in a small roadside inn outside Chur, that I found the first piece of the truth. I had checked in under a false name, still wearing half of the dress, looking like a madwoman. The owner didn't ask questions. In the room, there was a television with poor reception. I turned it on, needing distraction, and that's when I saw it. The news segment was short, almost casual. Authorities investigating a major financial fraud connected to a well-known family in Zurich. The name hit me like a fist. It was his family. My fiancé's father, his uncle, and several business associates. Billions siphoned, false accounts, shell companies. It wasn't new. Apparently, rumors had been circling for years. But the investigation had escalated that very week. They hadn't been arrested yet, but the anchor made it sound inevitable. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the remote. The dread made sense now. Somewhere inside, I had known. I had seen the signs but ignored them. The conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The sudden wealth that never had a source. The way his father looked at me as though I were another possession. If I had married him, I would have been tied to all of it, an accomplice by association. And maybe worse, someone disposable once I knew too much. I told myself I'd keep driving, that I'd vanish, maybe leave the country. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I heard footsteps in the hall outside my room. slow, deliberate. They stopped in front of my door. I held my breath, every nerve screaming. After a long pause, they moved on. I barely slept at all. The next morning, I went to pay for the room, and the owner asked if I wanted the receipt in my real name. My blood ran cold. I had never given it. When I stammered something about using a false one, she smiled oddly and said, "Your husband called here looking for you. I told him you'd left. I don't remember leaving, only that I was in the car again, my dress rumpled, my hair a mess, and I couldn't stop shaking. He knew. He was looking for me already. And if he was looking, he would find me. His family had reach, influence, and money enough to buy silence or compliance from anyone they wanted. From that point on, the road became my only safe place. I avoided towns, slept in the car, ate whatever I could find at small roadside shops. But paranoia gnawed at me. Every set of headlights behind me felt like pursuit, every stranger's glance like recognition. By the 5th day, exhaustion made my hands tremble on the wheel. I knew I couldn't keep running aimlessly. I needed to decide what to do. That decision came when I stopped at a small post office to buy stamps. While waiting, I overheard 2 men talking. They were discussing the fraud case, laughing about how untouchable the family thought they were, how someone needed to hand evidence directly to the authorities before it vanished. Something inside me shifted. I realized I had something no one else did: access. In the weeks before the wedding, I had seen documents in his study, files he had left out in careless confidence. I remembered names, account numbers, even codes he had boasted about in drunken pride. My fear hardened into resolve. If I was going to keep running, I would always be prey. But if I turned, if I exposed them, maybe I could end it. Maybe I could take away their power to chase me. The thought of it filled me with a strange, cold courage. I bought stationery and spent the next 2 nights in the car, writing everything I could remember. Dates, numbers, accounts, conversations, names. My memory was sharp with fear, and once I started, it poured out of me. When I was done, I sealed it in an envelope, addressed to the Swiss authorities. But the horror wasn't over. The night before I meant to mail it, I stopped at a rest area to wash my face. When I came back to the car, the passenger door was open. Someone had been inside. The envelope was gone. I froze. My body went numb. For minutes I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then I saw it on the seat. The envelope, untouched, but with a note pinned to it. Just one sentence, written in neat, familiar handwriting. "Come home and we will forget this." I vomited right there on the gravel. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. He had found me, had been close enough to break into the car while I was a few feet away. And yet he hadn't taken the envelope. He wanted me to know he could reach me any time. He wanted me afraid. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the car gripping the steering wheel, watching shadows shift, waiting for him to come back. By morning, something inside me broke. Fear twisted into rage. If he wanted me silent, I would scream louder. If he wanted me afraid, I would force myself to move anyway. I drove to the nearest post office I could find in a small town outside Zurich. I walked in, set the envelope on the counter, and told the clerk it was urgent. My voice didn't shake. I even watched him stamp it, watched it vanish into the system where his family couldn't pull it back. When I walked out, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt watched. And I was right. The next week blurred. I never went back to my apartment, never collected my belongings. I moved constantly, staying in roadside inns under false names. News trickled out in fragments. Arrests made, accounts frozen, properties seized. The family was falling apart, their empire crumbling. My fiancé's father was charged, his uncle fled, and my fiancé himself. He disappeared. Some said he fled abroad. Others said he was hiding. No one ever saw him again. But I did. Months later, when I had finally started to rebuild a life, I woke in a rented flat to find an envelope under my door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a single photo. Me sitting in my car outside the post office the day I mailed the documents. On the back, in the same neat handwriting, "You will always be mine." That was 36 years ago. I never married. I never stayed in one place long enough to be found. Even now, telling you this, I don't know if he's alive or dead. What I do know is that sometimes, when I'm driving long roads late at night, I see a car behind me with headlights that never pass, never fall back. And I know that dread in my chest, the same dread that made me walk out of that church, has never left me. I escaped the wedding. I exposed the crime. I saved myself from their empire. But I never escaped him. And that, I think, is the real horror. Not the fear of death, but the certainty that someone out there has marked you, claimed you, and will never let you go. Story number 7. I had been on the road since before sunrise, hauling crates of dry goods meant for small stores tucked away in the hills around Oaxaca. It wasn't unusual work for me, just long stretches of winding roads that required patience and a steady hand. I knew the route well enough, knew where the potholes would jar my bones and where the curves would test my focus. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that I'd be telling this story years later with a voice that still shakes when I get to the part where everything changed. The attack came fast. I saw a car pulled half across the road ahead, an old sedan with the hood up like it had overheated. 2 men waved for me to stop, their gestures desperate enough that instinct made me slow. Before my foot was even off the clutch, another truck rolled out from behind a stand of trees and blocked the road behind me. Doors slammed, boots hit gravel, and within seconds I was staring at 4 men with scarves pulled across their faces and machetes in their hands. I froze, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. One of them yanked open my door, shouting at me to get out. I tried to reason, told them I had nothing valuable, but they shoved me hard against the side of my own truck, patted me down, and laughed when they saw my shaking hands. They didn't care about my wallet or the little bit of cash I carried. They wanted the cargo. They climbed into the back, cutting ropes and tossing down crates like they were nothing more than boxes of scrap. I remember the sound of wood splintering as they smashed a few open, spilling packaged food onto the dirt. They piled what they could into their own vehicle, then into mine, until the bed looked half empty. One of them grabbed me by the collar and shoved me to the ground. "Stay down," he said in Spanish, low and final, like a warning that needed no repeating. They left me lying there as engines roared back to life. The sedan lurched forward, the second truck followed, and soon the road was quiet again except for my own pounding heart. I could have left it at that, reported the theft, claimed the insurance, chalked it up to bad luck on a dangerous road. But when I climbed back into my cab, I realized they hadn't taken everything. A good half of the shipment was gone, yes, but much of it was still scattered in the dirt, abandoned in their hurry. And there was something else that hit me as I sat there staring at the wreckage. The faces of the shopkeepers who'd been waiting for this delivery. They weren't rich men. They depended on these supplies to keep their little stores running, to feed their families. If I showed up empty-handed, it wouldn't just be my problem. It would ripple out, hurting everyone along the line. I gathered what I could, stacking broken crates back onto the bed. But the bigger loss weighed on me. The rest of the cargo was gone, taken deeper into the hills by men who knew I wouldn't dare follow. I thought about turning the truck around and driving back to Oaxaca City, but something stubborn wouldn't let me. Instead, I drove on to the next village, hoping maybe someone there could help. The village was small, a cluster of low houses, a tiny church, and a store where the owner, Miguel, knew me by name. When I told him what had happened, He listened without interruption, his face tightening as I described the bandits. When I finished, he didn't tell me to go home or leave it alone. He simply said, "They've been hitting us for months. You're not the first, but maybe you can help us be the last." That night, I sat with half a dozen men from the village, all of them weary but determined. They'd lost more than I had. Cattle taken, goods stolen, family members threatened. They knew the hills better than I ever could, knew where bandits might hole up, and which roads they used to vanish. The plan was simple and dangerous. At dawn, we would follow the tracks left by the tires and try to recover what was stolen. I didn't sleep much. My hands kept shaking when I thought about those men with machetes, the way they looked at me like I was nothing. But I also couldn't shake the faces of the villagers, the quiet anger in their eyes, the way Miguel's voice carried when he said, "Enough was enough." The next morning we set out in 2 trucks. I rode in the passenger seat of Miguel's, a shotgun across his lap, my stomach churning with every bump in the road. We followed the tracks until they veered off onto a narrow dirt path that wound up into the hills. After an hour, we found signs, food wrappers, splintered wood, the remains of crates tossed aside. My chest tightened. This was mine. These were the goods they'd taken. We pressed on until the road narrowed to little more than a trail. And then we saw it. An old shack, half collapsed, with smoke curling from a barrel fire outside. 2 men were there, standing guard, rifles slung over their shoulders. We killed the engines and crouched low. Miguel whispered fast instructions, dividing us into 2 groups. My heart hammered so loud I was sure they could hear it. The approach was slow, tense. I stayed with Miguel, circling to the left. The others crept right. When the first shout rang out, everything broke loose. Gunshots cracked through the air, sharp and terrifying. I hit the dirt, covering my head, ears ringing. Miguel fired back, his face grim, his jaw clenched. I'd never been so close to violence, never smelled the gunpowder or felt the shock of bullets snapping through branches overhead. One guard went down quickly, clutching his side. The other fled toward the shack, shouting for help. More men poured out, armed with machetes, pipes, even another rifle. The fight turned chaotic. Villagers surged forward, outnumbering them, but every swing of a blade, every scream, made my stomach twist tighter. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was running toward the back of the shack, driven by something I still can't explain. Inside, stacked against the wall, were my crates, the missing half of my load. Seeing them there, untouched, filled me with a surge of relief so strong it nearly dropped me to my knees. I shouted for the others, and a few men broke away from the fight to help drag them out. But then I heard Miguel cry out. I turned to see him on the ground, his shotgun knocked away, a man raising a machete above him. Without thinking, I grabbed a length of wood from the shack and swung. It connected with the man's back, dropping him long enough for Miguel to scramble up and recover his weapon. He looked at me, eyes wide, a flash of something between gratitude and shock. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The bandits, realizing they were outnumbered, scattered into the hills. We stood there in the wreckage, breathing hard, surrounded by blood and broken crates. A few villagers were injured, but none fatally. 2 of the bandits lay dead, their bodies sprawled in the dirt. The rest were gone. We loaded the recovered goods back onto the trucks in silence. No one celebrated. No one smiled. The weight of what we'd just done pressed down on all of us. For me, it was heavier than the cargo. I kept seeing the faces of the men we'd killed, the shock in their eyes when they realized the villagers had fought back. I told myself they'd chosen this life, chosen violence, but it didn't erase the image of their blood on the ground. Back in the village, the goods were divided. I got what I needed to finish my deliveries. The rest was shared among the people who had risked their lives beside me. Miguel shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes steady. "You stood with us," he said simply. "That matters." I drove on after that, finished my route, delivered what I could. But I wasn't the same. The road felt different beneath my tires, heavier somehow. Every time I passed a broken-down car, every time I saw a figure by the roadside, my chest tightened. I knew now what could happen, how fast things could turn. I never went back to that shack, never wanted to. But I carried the memory with me, the sound of gunfire echoing in the hills, the feel of splintered wood in my hands, the sight of crates stacked like trophies in the dark. And I carried the knowledge that in those moments, faced with fear and violence, I hadn't run. The villagers told me later that the bandits never came back. Word spread that they'd been driven off, that some had died. Maybe it was enough to keep them away. Maybe they moved on to easier prey. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. All I know is that a part of me stayed in those hills. The part that still wakes at night, hearing the crack of rifles, seeing Miguel on the ground, feeling the weight of a choice I never thought I'd have to make. I tell this story because it reminds me of how fragile everything is. A road, a load of goods, a simple trip through the mountains. All it takes is one moment, one group of men, one decision, and your life is cut into before and after. Mine was. And no matter how many miles I drive, no matter how many deliveries I make, I'll never leave Oaxaca behind. Story number 8. I was 13 when I found the map. At that age, I didn't think much about consequences, and I certainly didn't think about fear the way I do now. Back then, fear was a quick jolt in the chest when someone shouted at me, or the empty ache in my stomach when I went to bed without food. Living in an orphanage outside Pokhara, most of my days were built around routine. Chores, classes, and endless waiting for a future no one could promise me. But that day, everything shifted, and I've never forgotten it, no matter how much I've tried. I had been wandering near the bus park, watching tourists shuffle around with their cameras, when I noticed the abandoned car. It was parked near the edge of the lot, dusty, the back door slightly open. Curiosity pulled me closer. Inside, there wasn't much. Empty bottles, a torn guidebook, and a folded piece of paper wedged between the seat cushions. I tugged it free and realized it was a hand-drawn map, not like the tourist maps sold in the stalls, but one marked with strange lines and tiny symbols I couldn't understand. I knew enough English to make out the faint words, Old Tunnel and Crossing Point. At first I thought it was some kind of treasure map, and my heart raced with the idea of finding something valuable, something that could change my life. I stuffed it into my pocket and ran back toward the hills, where the roads gave way to narrow paths and silence. Following the map wasn't easy. I had to compare landmarks, guess at the crooked lines, and backtrack more than once. Still, the idea of hidden places pulled me forward. When I finally found the spot marked with a star, I felt a rush of triumph. It was a crack in the hillside, hidden behind overgrowth. At first glance, it looked like nothing. But when I pushed past, I saw it opened into a rough tunnel, just big enough for someone to slip through. The smell inside was sharp and earthy, and the darkness pressed close around me. I didn't have a flashlight, but I lit a match from a box I'd stolen from the orphanage kitchen. The flame flickered, throwing weak light ahead. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. I should have turned back, but my stubbornness pushed me forward. I imagined gold, old relics, maybe even a place to hide from the world that never wanted me. I must have walked 10 minutes before I saw the first sign that this place wasn't abandoned. A wooden crate, cracked and half open, sat against the wall. Inside were cigarette packs, wrapped in foreign labels I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it belonged to smugglers, but I didn't fully grasp what that meant at 13. All I knew was that I had stumbled into something secret, something that didn't feel safe. I turned to leave, but then I heard voices echoing down the tunnel. My stomach dropped. I scrambled behind the crate, crouching low, barely breathing. The match had burned out, and now I was blind in the dark, relying only on my ears. The voices grew louder, men speaking Nepali mixed with words I didn't understand. They were dragging something heavy, boxes maybe, and laughing in a way that made my skin crawl. They stopped not far from where I hid. One of them struck a lighter, and in that dim flame I caught glimpses of their faces. Hard eyes, rough features, men who looked like they belonged to danger. They set down their loads, talking about shipments and police and money. I didn't understand every word, but I understood enough. They were moving things illegally through these tunnels. Then one of them said something that froze me. He mentioned a boy spotted near the bus park earlier that day. A boy who looked like he didn't belong, hanging around where he shouldn't. My blood went cold. They were talking about me. I pressed my hands over my mouth, praying they wouldn't think to look behind the crates. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they'd hear it. Minutes passed like hours before they finally moved deeper into the tunnel, carrying their cargo. When the echoes of their voices faded, I forced myself to move, every instinct screaming to run. I crawled out of the tunnel, tearing my arms on the rough stone, and burst into the daylight, gasping like I'd been drowning. I should have left it alone then, burned the map, pretended it had never happened. But something in me wouldn't let go. I wanted to know more. Maybe it was childish curiosity, or maybe it was the hunger for something bigger than my small life. But the next day, I returned. This time I waited until evening. The map showed more tunnels, branching routes, symbols I hadn't explored. I brought a stolen flashlight and crept back in. My hands shook the whole time, but I pushed forward, deeper than before. That's when I found the second chamber. It wasn't just crates this time, it was people. At first I thought they were travelers resting in the dark, but as my eyes adjusted I realized they were tied, gagged, their faces hollow with fear. There were 3 of them. 2 men and a woman. One of the men locked eyes with me, his look desperate, pleading. I panicked, fumbling to step back, but the scrape of my shoe on the stone echoed louder than thunder. One of the captives groaned, and in that instant I knew I wasn't alone. The smugglers came fast, their voices sharp, their footsteps like hammer blows in the tunnel. I killed the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, but it was too late. A hand clamped around my arm, fingers digging into my flesh. One of the men snarled at me, dragging me into the light of his torch. I'll never forget his face, the scar across his cheek, the cold satisfaction in his eyes when he saw how young I was. He asked me who I was, why I was there. I stammered, begged, tried to say I was lost. They didn't believe me. Another man searched my pockets and pulled out the map. They looked at it, then at me, their anger turning to something darker. "You shouldn't have seen this," one of them muttered. They argued in low tones, deciding what to do with me. My chest heaved, tears burning my eyes, but I held them back. Crying wouldn't save me. Then, in a twist I couldn't have predicted, one of the men said to leave me. "He's just a kid," he argued. "Scaring him is enough." He won't talk, but the scarred man disagreed. He said children were dangerous because children talked. His hand tightened on my arm, and I thought that was the end. Then, from deeper in the tunnel, a sound echoed. Shouting, whistles, the unmistakable command of police. The smugglers cursed, shoved me aside, and scrambled to hide their evidence. One dragged me by the collar and hissed into my ear, "If you speak, we'll find you." Then they vanished into a side passage I hadn't noticed before, leaving me shaking on the ground. The police stormed in minutes later, torches blinding me. They found the crates, the captives, everything. I was pulled out with the rest, coughing, filthy, barely able to speak. When they asked me how I got there, I told them about the map, the car, the tunnels. I told them everything. They didn't believe all of it. Some of them thought I was exaggerating, a child inventing drama. But the captives confirmed the smugglers, and the crates spoke for themselves. The police sealed the tunnels, posted guards, and promised they'd find the men who escaped. For weeks, I lived in fear that they'd come for me, that the scarred man would keep his promise. At night, I dreamed of his eyes, that cold certainty. Every sound outside the orphanage made me jump. But time passed, and they never returned. I later learned the tunnels had been used for decades, a network carved out by old traders and later claimed by criminals. Smuggling drugs, weapons, even people. It had all happened under the feet of tourists and children like me. My discovery wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last, but it was the only time I realized how close I had come to disappearing forever. Now, years later, I still think about that day. I think about the captives' faces, about the scarred man's grip on my arm, about the way my life could have ended in the dark. I wonder sometimes why one of them wanted to spare me. Maybe he had a child of his own. Maybe he didn't want my blood on his hands. I'll never know. What I do know is this. Curiosity nearly killed me, and that map wasn't treasure. It was a trap, a window into a world I was never meant to see. And no matter how far I've traveled since, no matter how much older I've grown, part of me is still that boy in the tunnel, clutching a stolen map, praying the dark won't swallow him whole. That's the end of our 8 Appalachian Blue Ridge horror stories. Which one haunted you the most? If you made it this far, drop "The Blue Ridge is watching" in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep your lantern close. The mountains are never truly silent.